And today I'd like to continue on with this theme of prayers from the Bible by looking at a prayer of David. And there's lots of prayers of David because many of the Psalms are really prayers. And I've chosen to look at Psalm 32, and I'd like you to turn there with me. Psalm 32, because it is one of the examples of a prayer of confession. It is one of the what is known as the 7 penitential psalms, because there are 7 psalms that deal with the problem of sin, and probably the one that you're most familiar with is Psalm 51. But there's 7 others. This is one of them. This is probably the second most well-known one. I'd encourage you during the week, as we learn about prayers in the Bible, to look at the other penitential psalms. So I'll just list them for you. Psalm 6, Psalm 38, Psalm 102, Psalm 130, and Psalm 143. And together, all of these 7 point to the importance of the prayer of confession, using prayer as a means of confession in a relationship with God. They all talk about sin. And before we look at the passage, before we read it, I'd like just to mention, that in the when sin is mentioned in our modern society, there's usually 2 different reactions. The first one is laughter, because the most common use of sin in our culture today is in a lighthearted, ironic way, usually in the form of a joke or an advertisement. I found one company on the internet. Its name is Sinful Sweets, because they sell sweets, chocolates, and one of the most promising ones is chocolate-covered bacon. What a perfect combination, for a lot of us. That's got to be good. So good it's sinful. Oh, I want some. And so that's kind of this lighthearted use of sin. Is probably the most common use in public discourse. But the way we find sin described here in the passage we're going to look at today, when sin is mentioned in this way in our society today, it's usually greeted with either like a nervousness, bracing over some kind of impending guilt trip that somebody's going to place on you, or there's people that just tune it out in protest because we really ought not to talk about moral values in public, because they're really the best talked and kept just to private reflection. And then some people are now even protesting publicly when we mention sin as some form of hate speech. And yet, when we look at the Bible, we see that the Bible teaches that there is nothing more important to practical living and human flourishing than an understanding of sin in general and a recognition of the sins in our own life. And as we look at this passage, I'd like you to just look for that. Let's read this, and I'll read it, and I'd like you to stand with me, and it's in your pew Bibles if you're using them, on page 461. Out of reverence to God, let's just to his word. Let's stand, and I'll be reading it from the English Standard Version. Psalm 32, a maskil of David. Blessed is the one whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. Blessed is the man against whom the Lord counts no iniquity, and in whose spirit there is no deceit. For when I kept silent, my bones wasted away through my groaning all day long. For day and night your hand was heavy upon me. My strength was dried up as by the heat of summer. Selah. When I acknowledged my sin to you and I did not cover my iniquity, I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the iniquity of my sin. Selah. Up to that point, he's speaking in the first person to God. And then he goes on, therefore, let everyone who is godly offer prayer to you at a time when you may be found. Surely in the rush of great waters they shall not reach him. You are a hiding place for me. You preserve me from trouble. You surround me with shouts of deliverance. Now in verses 8 and 9, it shifts from David speaking to the Lord speaking back to David now. And the Lord says, I will instruct you and teach you in the way you should go. I will counsel you with my eye upon you. But not like, be not like a horse or a mule without understanding, which must be curbed with bit and bridle, or it will stay away, it will not stay near you. Many are the sorrows of the wicked, but steadfast love surrounds the one who trusts in the Lord. And then in the last verse, it's David again speaking to the people. And he says, be glad in the Lord and rejoice, O righteous, and shout for joy, all you upright in heart. This is the word of God. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. In this passage, I think we see this passage teaches us three things about sin. The first thing is the poisonous reality of sin. The second thing is the liberating confession of sin. And the last thing is what I'm going to call the life-giving antidote for sin. So those are the three main points that I'd like to talk about from this passage. Let's begin with the poisonous reality of sin. And again, let's just ask the Lord to speak to us through his word. Father God, I pray that you would help us to put aside the distractions and to be able to really focus on hearing your voice speaking through your Spirit and your inspired word. And I pray that it would speak deeply into our hearts and that we would be receptive to your message and we'd be able to hear it and have a desire to apply it and experience a joy in the great news that we find here. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, we begin with the poisonous reality of sin, and we see it in four different terms for sin in the first three verses. And I'd like you to just notice in verse 1, blessed is the one whose transgression is forgiven. Transgression, it's the Hebrew word pesha, and it some translations translate it, I think the Net Bible translates it, rebellious act. It has this idea of rebellious self-assertion. It's expressed in the attitude when somebody's, told to do something, that attitude of, well, no one's going to tell me what to do. It's this attitude of this inner hatred of any thing that places limits on our desires. And that kind of attitude really poisons the quality of our life and also makes the world a miserable and dangerous place. Because, there's a lot of limits that, are really good for us. There's laws. Laws place limits on us, and promises that we make place limits on us, and really are the building blocks of both families and cultures and societies. And yet, this attitude that hates limitations placed upon its desires, it responds to laws with the desire to break them, and with promises with the desire to disregard them, to break them as well. And really, when you think about it, you can't have relationships without losing independence. Because as you experience new relationships in your life, every relationship introduces more limitations. For example, if the closer you are to a friend, the more limitations there are on the ways that you can just behave any way you want around the friend, or your wife, or your children, or your parents. They all put certain limitations on your behavior. And so if your attitude is to rebel against anything that limits the expression or the achievement or the experience of those things that you desire, you're going to want to break those relationships as well. And so as a result, we have a lot of lives full of broken relationships. And so you can see how rebellion can poison life and culture and society. And the second word is probably the most common word that we use, and it's translated by the common word in English, sin, whose sin is covered at the end of verse 1. And typically we think of this as missing the mark, and I think that's a good understanding of it. It's almost the equivalent in meaning to the New Testament word that in the Greek text that we find. But I'm not sure how helpful it is, missing the mark. I mean, I think it can be helpful, but there's another way of understanding it. It's like going off the path, and usually we're not shooting at a target, but we are following paths in our daily lives. We're on paths, we're roads, we're taking walks down paths. This last week, somebody introduced me, one of my new neighbors introduced me to a bike path, actually a bike trail. I think maybe some of you have heard of it, the Silver Creek Trail up above Jacksonville. And I'm used to trails. When I think of a bike trail, I typically think from California, the San Gabriel Mountains, even though they have some single tracks, it's generally these wide fire access roads. And that's what I was expecting. And I got up there with my friend Dwayne, and it really was a trail. It's a mountain bike trail about 8 to 10 inches wide. And on one side you have this really steep slope that's either covered with trees or rocks, and on the other side it was covered with poison oak the whole way. And we rode about 6-8 miles. I don't know how long, but I remember as I just started out, I thought, boy, I got to keep on this trail. I've got to really focus on where I'm at, because I can't just kind of wander back and forth like I'm used to looking around. I've got to focus right on that trail. And trails are designed to keep us safe and to help us successfully get to one place to another. And God's law is like a trail. It's like God's path for us. And he wants us to stay on the path. And when we get off the path, we get ourselves into trouble and get into danger and the things around us that can destroy our lives and begin to affect us. For example, let's use the example of lying. When when you lie to someone, even if they don't know, they never discover the lie. Think about it, how it affects the relationship. When you lie to someone, even if they never know it, you know it. So, that's going to affect the depth of your relationship. You're going to have to be more vigilant and careful and cautious and guarded about what you say, and be less transparent in developing that relationship for fear of somebody might discover the lie. It doesn't, and also it dehumanizes the person that you lie to, because you treat them like an object to manipulate through the lie rather than a person to tell the truth to and to build a relationship with. And in turn, it also dehumanizes you. So it has this poisonous effect when we get off the path. And then the third, and one other thing, studies have shown that those that lie to others tend to not trust others because they expect that they're probably also lying. And so it really destroys the potential of a flourishing life in God's world. And then the third word we see in the beginning of verse 2. Blessed is the man against whom the Lord counts no iniquity. And we don't usually use iniquity and commonly in public discourse. So I think this is a little bit more difficult. And some translations translate guilt, but really iniquity, I think it's probably a good word. We just need to learn the meaning of it. It refers to the perverseness, the wickedness, the twistedness of a sinful act. In his Confessions, St. Augustine provided probably one of the most classic examples of this throughout church history, when he describes the story of when he's 16 years old and he joins his friends in stealing pears from one of his neighbor's pear trees. And as he reflects back on the experience about what most people would just consider a teenage prank, he's deeply disturbed by the fact that he realized that he didn't steal the pears for their beauty, because he says that it was an ugly tree and the pears were ugly. In fact, he didn't even like pears. And on the other hand, his parents had trees of their own pears that were much better than the pears of his neighbor's trees. And so he realized that he simply did it because it was forbidden. To use his own words, he says, I realized that I did not desire to enjoy what I stole, but only the theft and the sin itself. I mean, that's iniquity. That's this perversity, this twistedness to the sin. And it was through this experience, as he reflected on it, that he discovered within himself what he called a depraved soul, or a perverted will that, again, to use his own words, sought nothing from the shameful deed but shame itself. I mean, that's the iniquity, the evilness of the act. And then there's one more word that we see referring to sin here, and it's at the end of verse 2. Blessed is the man against whom the Lord counts no iniquity, and in whose spirit there is no deceit. The word deceit means, falsehood. It also has this idea of idleness, in the sense of an idle ambivalence toward the truth and toward what is right. And the problem with this understanding of sin is not only is deceit a sin, but it is also one of the greatest obstacles for us to acknowledging our own sins. Now, we think of Satan as a great deceiver, yes, but according to verse 2, the root of deception lies in our own heart and soul, in whose spirit there is no deceit. It's in the spirit where deceit resides, and until we get the deceit out of our spirit, until we abandon and renounce that deceit in our own spirit, we really cannot recognize or acknowledge or take ownership over our sins. I mean, it's an obstacle to confession. And so he further explains this in verse 3. He says, "For," and I think he's explaining the nature of deceit, the results of deceit. He says, "For when I kept silent," silent about my sin. Some translations add that to help us understand that he's referring about his sin there. This idea of silence. David, as he prays this prayer, he recognizes that his twisted self, that iniquity, that wickedness within him is seeking to either ignore the sin by silence or cover the sin by deceit. We know that in verse 5, when he finally comes to confessing the sin, it says, "I acknowledged my sin to thee and to you, and I did not cover my iniquity." In other words, I stopped trying to cover up my evilness, my perversity, my twistedness. And we know from the classic, great well-known sin of David and Bathsheba, and his deception of Uriah, and eventually the murder of Uriah, the husband of Bathsheba, to cover up his sin, that he was desperately trying to cover it up, and yet he couldn't, because he had forgotten what God warned his people about back in Numbers, when he said, when you go into the land, obey this law that I've given you. And the Lord warns, be sure your sins will find you out if you don't. And he had forgotten that. And Nathan comes to him and accuses him, and then he writes Psalm 51. And so as he deals with the stain of his own iniquity in his soul, he describes how he is tormented in verse 4 and verse 3, verse 3 and verse 4. Tormented day and night, wasting away. And some translations put the word, have the word bones, which is the literal word there. Other translations will translate it body. It really refers to the kind of the core of his identity, is wasting away like some incurable cancer. And then finally, he says that rather than a source of power and strength in the past, the hand of God weighs heavy upon him as he is still living in God's presence. God still has his hand upon his anointed, and yet the heaviness just saps him of his own strength. It's the opposite of what he normally would draw from God's presence, strength to serve God. Now he's losing it. And so we see in those 4 words, and these are really, particularly the first 3, are the fundamental terms that we'll see come up over and over and over again in the Old Testament. There's other words too, but these are the key ones, and I think that's why this passage is so important. It helps us to understand the poison reality of sin. And then we see the confession, what I call the liberating confession of sin in verse 5. He says, I acknowledged my sin to you, and I did not cover my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgression to the Lord, and you forgave the iniquity of my sin. Genuine confession is liberating because it relieves our conscience of the stain of guilt that we try to hide. I tried to think of examples, and other than, perhaps some of you are familiar with the Scottish play Macbeth, and you have that great scene in there where Lady Macbeth, she cries out, "Oh, the stain, oh, this stain," and she's referring to this sense of this guilt that she has over her involvement in the murder with her husband of King Duncan. This stain that just she can't relieve herself of. This guilt, and this is an important theme in a lot of stories in our culture. Even though our culture prides itself in being a guilt-free society, think about it, almost all the horror movies have to do with some guilt that is unresolved, and a theme that runs in a lot. So I think that even though our culture tries to shake itself from this guilt trip that sin, we reluctantly experience from the guilt of sin, we can't shake it. But genuine confession, it relieves us, it liberates us of that sense that something is wrong deep down within us. I mean, and most, people, when you're talking to them in their heart of hearts, they know that something is not right in the core of their being. It silences, liberating confession, genuine confession, it silences that voice that reminds us, that really there's something wrong with us, that we're just not good enough, because we aren't, and that we're really not that good of a person as we'd like to be, because we know that we really aren't. We were there when we did those bad things, and we know what we do, and it goes with us, and that voice, we want to silence it. We want it to go away. And so genuine confession, when it's genuine, it liberates us from that, but it also, genuine confession, also liberates us because it actually changes us so that we stop doing the things that we don't want to do anymore. I mean, that's really the difference there. Liberating confession just doesn't deal with the guilt, but it also results in an actual change within us. There's at least 3 parts to genuine confession. And the first part is found in just the 2 words in that first, in the first phrase of verse 5. I acknowledged my sin to you, to God. In Psalm 51, David puts it this way: against you, you only have I sinned. David speaking to God. Against you have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight, so that you may be justified in your words and blameless in your judgment. The first thing that we see that's an essential part of genuine worship that results in liberation and freedom from the sin that we confess is that we need a clear standard to evaluate what is a sin. We need a clear standard. We need to know what God thinks about it. We need to know God's standard. It's God's word that we measure ourselves against. And I'd like you to turn with me, just stay there in the passage in Psalm 32, but I'd like you to turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 4, where Paul refers to other standards that often are used. In verse 3 and 4, he says to the Corinthians some actually kind of rather surprising things. But in verses 3 and 4, he says, I care very little if I am judged by you or by any human court. In other words, the standard, I really don't care about what you think is right and wrong or what some human court thinks is right and wrong. That's what he says. He goes on and says, and indeed, I do not even judge myself. I don't even care what I think. He says, my conscience is clear, but that does not make me innocent. I mean, I don't judge myself because I know I can't even trust my own conscience. It is the Lord who judges me. We need a moral straight edge that we can trust in evaluating what's sin or not, to determine the difference between false guilt and genuine guilt, and really to identify what sins we need to confess and what ones. We cannot trust public opinion. Why? Because it's always changing. I mean, we saw that last week with the Supreme Court. After 4 years of some 30 states voting against, same-sex marriage, the Supreme Court 5-4 votes that it's okay. And now it's okay and everybody's celebrating it. And so if we look to public opinion, it's going to be changing all the time. That's not a good place. That's not a good moral straight edge. But surely, Jiminy Cricket is right when he sings, always let our conscience be our guide. We can trust our conscience. No, not according to Paul. We can't even trust that. Because what we thought 20 years ago was wrong is okay today. I mean, 20 years ago, honestly, the ladies going out to the 4 daughters noticed the subprint in the announcement, Irish pub. I'm Irish background. I know what a pub is. Now, 20 years ago, I thought that was the place you shouldn't go to, particularly a church meeting of women. But it's okay now, and it's all right. My wife and I have actually gone to a pub or two on a date. So I don't tell my mom. Mom, are you here? I don't think my mother made it. I need to check on her. She was supposed to be here. But anyway, don't tell her. But, we can't trust our conscience. And 1 John chapter 3 tells us, whenever our heart condemns us, God is greater than our heart. Sometimes our heart condemns us when it shouldn't condemn us. Because sometimes we think something is wrong when it really isn't. And other times, something is wrong when we think it isn't. So how are we going to base confession upon our conscience? That's not a good guide. Neither public opinion, human courts, or even our own conscience are a reliable standard. The only moral straight edge that we can depend upon is God's opinion, God's voice, God's word. And then, so we need a sure, a clear, in confession, we need a clear standard. And the second thing we need to do is we need to take full responsibility for our sin. And you'll notice there in verse 5, the key word that's repeated over and over again, just 2-letter word, my. Do you see it there? My sin, my iniquity, my transgression, without explaining away, without rationalizing, without blame shifting. Not like, yes, I did that, but if you had a father like I had, you'd do the same. Or if you had a wife or a child like you would do the same. Well, that's not genuine confession. That's admitting that you've done something, but that's not taking ownership over its wickedness. Difficult circumstances and annoying people maybe provide us the occasion for our sin, but they're not the cause of our sin. We are. And for genuine confession, for confession to be truly liberating confession, like he talks about here, we need to take ownership. We need to take full responsibility for the arrogance of our rebellious acts, for the insanity of going off the path, sin. I mean, that's what the prodigal son did, didn't he? He came to his senses, it says, and then he realized that he could go back to his father. It's only when he came to his senses. Sin is senseless. It is stupid. And you can't overstate the stupidity of it, and we need to acknowledge the stupidity of our own sin. And the perverse ugliness of our iniquity. And it's only when we do that, if we don't do that, then after we acknowledge the sin, we'll go right back to it as soon as the shame and the discomfort of its consequences fade. And then the third thing that we need in true confession is we need to distinguish true confession from either self-pity on the one hand or self-punishment on the other hand. I think this is where most of us, in our attempts to confess and acknowledge our sin, we're drawn based upon our personalities to one or the other, self-pity or self-punishment. I think we can see self-pity in verses 3 and 4, and I think it's significant because it's not until verse 5 that he actually acknowledges his sin. Notice, I think you have elements of self-pity there in verse 3. He says, my body. He's concerned about my groaning. He's concerned about my strength. He's concerned about what his sin was doing to himself. He hated the consequences of the sin more than the sin. Self-pity is when we're concerned about how the sin has affected us rather than how has it affected God, and the fact that it's wicked in and of itself. And so you can easily understand how self-pity really is going to help us with being, experiencing freedom from the sin. Because, if it's really the consequences of the sin that we're really regretful for, then once those consequences fade, we're going to go right back to the sin because we never really decided that we didn't like it to begin with. It reminds me of what my mother used to say to me when she would, catch me in something that some act of disobedience. And I would come to her and say, oh, I'm so sorry, Mom. And she would look at me and she could see right through me. She'd say, you're sorry, you're just sorry you got caught. Except for one time. Do we have time? Real quick. Except for one time. She didn't see through it. I was 12 years old, wanted to stay home on Sunday night. And so I told Mom and Dad, I don't feel good. I want to stay home from church, because we always went to church at Ashland First Baptist on Sunday nights. It was back in the old days. And The Wonderful World of Disney was on Sunday night, and I wanted to watch it, and I could never watch it, and all my friends were watching it. So I had to get in my pajamas, of course, to convince her that I was really sick. And so they went to church, and I stayed home. Right after The Wonderful World of Disney, the movie The Good, Bad, and the Ugly came on. And I loved these Westerns, and they had guns. And I was watching it as a 12-year-old thinking, we have a gun like those guns. They have those lever action guns in there. That's really cool. We got one. Look how it's cool. I'm going to go get it. And I went up and got the gun. And I brought it back down, and then I thought, oh, it doesn't work without the shells. So I'm watching The Good, Bad, and the Ugly, and I put the shells in it. And went and found the 30-30 shells and loaded. And I started running, and I was watching them, the guy was going, and I thought, oh yeah, that's cool. Man, look, it's just like that. This is cool. My dad's deer rifle, Winchester, the 1895 model. And then it got stuck, and I was downstairs in the basement in our television family room, we called it, with no windows, just one door, wood paneling. And it got stuck, and I just forced it, and boom! And suddenly I couldn't hear anything. And I thought, oh, I shot the television. I looked at the television, it's still working. And then I thought, oh, where did the bullet go? And I was looking along the wood paneling, and then I noticed, oh, fortunately, the bullet hit that little groove between the panels of the wood paneling, the little dark groove, and you really had to look to see it, and it was like directly on that little black, and I thought, oh, phew, man, that's good, and so I quickly, put the gun away, and came back downstairs, and I thought, wow, man, I just got to calm down, because they're going to be coming home pretty soon, and then I was thinking, what's on the other side of that wall? And then I went around the other side of the wall, and there's a big refrigerator, a Norge refrigerator there. That was an old one, but it was our second backup one that was still working. And I was looking where it would have come right through the wall, right behind this. And I got behind the Norge, and I looked in the wall behind. There it is. It's right there. I could see a little daylight from the room, And then I looked in the back of the Norge refrigerator, and there was a blast of a hole right through the middle of the freezer part. And then right then I began to realize, okay, my plan of kind of silence and not thinking about, not mentioning it is not going to work. And then this is just in just seconds, but it's in slow motion in my mind. I moved around to the front of it, and as I moved around to the front of it, I opened the door, and the plastic door to the freezer part, boom, it was all blown apart. And then I looked at the inside of the door, and it had a hole in it too. And then I shut it, and then I didn't even see when I walked up to it, it had this hole right in the front. And then I thought, oh no, there's no way for me to cover this up. I'm going to have to confess it. What am I going to do? My dad, he's going to whip my tail. They're going to be so upset with me. And I waited, and it was probably 45 minutes. And finally I heard the car pull into the garage with my mother and my father and my two siblings that were still at home. And I went out, I said, I got to get over this. Man, I was sweating it out. You read, about groaning all day long. I was groaning for 45 minutes, and man, my strength was gone, and I was sweating it out. And my parents got out of the car, and I just walked right up to them. And as soon as I walked up to them, I said, oh, Mom, Dad, I'm so sorry. I went upstairs, and I got the gun, and I went, I was one of the, and then I couldn't hear the and then it blew away, and then the refrigerator, and I walked around him and showed him the crime scene, as I was crying. And they stood in front of him when I finally done, what are you going to do to me? And they said, well, and they didn't even talk about it. They just looked at each other, Mom and Dad, and they said, well, son, we think you've suffered enough. And on the inside, I just went, but on the outside, I went, Oh, thank you. On the inside, I went, yes! Boy, I got through it. And again, an example. I mean, confession, because I wanted to avoid the consequences. Well, now I've used up too much time, but I couldn't resist. Take responsibility. You need to distinguish true confession from either self-pity or self-punishment. And you need to acknowledge the actual wickedness of the sin. And it's only when he acknowledges that he's actually forgiven of the wickedness of the sin. Not just the sin, but the wickedness, the iniquity of it. Verse 5. I said, I will confess my transgression to the Lord, and you forgave the evilness, the wickedness, the badness of the sin, because I acknowledged that it was bad. We need to avoid those two extremes, self-pity, hating the consequences of sin. If that's all we're doing, it's not going to change. There's no behavior, there's not going to be no transformation, there's not going to be any liberation from the confession. It's just going to perpetuate the cover-up, the deceit. And on the other hand, self-punishment. Some of us, our personalities are more prone to self-punishment. You know we are a despicable, awful person for committing these sins. We are so bad, we don't want to be forgiven. We want to pay for it ourselves. We want to beat ourselves up and punish ourselves and weep endlessly about the sin to show how miserable we are and somehow atone for it ourselves. We cannot. There's no way. So, what's the solution? Well, the antidote. And the antidote is found, so we've talked about the poisonous reality of sin, the liberating effects of true confession, and then finally, we need a fundamental antidote for this poison. We need an antidote, and it's a joyous antidote. It's a stunning antidote, and it's hard to wrap our minds around. But it's right there in the very first verse. Blessed is the one whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. How do you cover sin? How is sin covered? Blessed is the one whose sin the Lord does not count against him. How can a just God decide not to count sin against a sinner if he's truly just? Well, Paul explains. And in conclusion, I'd like you just to look at Paul's commentary on Psalm 32. And this is the best part. The best part here is Romans chapter 4. Paul quotes Psalm 32 here. Starting in verse 5, he says, "And to the one who does not work but believes in him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is counted as righteousness. Just as David also spoke of the blessing of the one to whom God counts righteousness apart from works." And then he goes on and quotes these verses. "Blessed is the man against whom the Lord will not count his sin." Now, I'd like you to think about the difference between what Paul says in verses 6 and 7, counts as righteous, and what David says in the Psalms. He says, does not count the sin against us. It seems like there's a little bit of a difference there. I mean, there's a difference between just not counting a sin against someone that would make them regard them as innocent and considering them a righteous person. Because there's a difference between being innocent. I mean, a newborn baby is innocent, but a newborn baby isn't righteous because it hasn't done anything right yet. And so how does God count us to be righteous, to actually be obedient, righteous people, upright, straight? Well, last week, Pastor Greg reviewed the doctrine of atonement. I hope you were paying attention because he did a great job how he explained the doctrine of atonement that makes this possible, this forgiveness possible through Christ taking on our sin and dying in our place. But when you think about it, that only, what Christ does through taking on our sin and dying in our place, that only cancels the sin. It only provides the forgiveness of the sin, enabling God not to count our sins against us. But that does not really explain how we are counted righteous. How does that work? Well, there's two ways to experience God's blessing in the Psalms. The first way actually isn't in Psalm 32. That's the second way. The first way is in Psalm 1. And most of you are much more familiar with Psalm 1 than Psalm 32 because you read it, some of you memorized it. Blessed is the man who does not stand in the way of sinners or sit in the seat of, I can't remember all, the wicked sinners and the scoffers, and delights in the law of the Lord and meditates on it day and night, and he will be prosperous in all he does. We like that psalm. But really, that's one way to be blessed, to experience God's shalom, God's pleasure. The other way is Psalm 32. Now, how many have experienced Psalm 1 the way it's presented there? I mean, it says, it doesn't say just occasionally doesn't walk in the way of sinners, but never walks in the way, sits in the seat of scoffers, stands in the path of the wicked. It never does it. And always, it doesn't use the word always, but it means the word always because it delights in the law of the Lord day and night, always without exception. Who does that? I don't. Do you? Has anyone ever done that? Could anyone qualify to experience the blessings of Psalm 1? There's only one person. That's the reason the early church, when they read, blessed is the man. It's not just a man, Psalm 1, but the man, the one man. They considered Psalm 1 as describing Christ. Christ is the only one that has obeyed perfectly the law. He's the only one that's experienced the reality and the full force of the promise and the principle of Psalm 1. And how can we be counted as righteous? Well, we're out of time, but it's in the Psalms, in Psalm 31, but it's also here in Romans chapter 8. This is the gospel. This is the good news. Not only when we express our faith in Christ does God promise, because of Christ's death on the cross in our place for our sins, to have paid the penalty, therefore he promises to forgive us. But he also promises through our faith to count to us the perfect obedience of Christ. Not just his one act of obedience to the cross, but his whole life. That's the reason he had to come for 33 years, to live a whole life rather than just a week. Because he had to live a perfectly righteous life from birth till middle age, without exception, so that the fullness of the gospel could be experienced by all of us. That is, all of that perfect righteousness of Christ is attributed to us. So it's once we've experienced and practiced true confession, the way we've described it here, with the right standard, acknowledging our responsibility for the sin, and we embrace the truth of the gospel, that we are righteous and we are upright, not by our own obedience, but by the obedience of Christ that's attributed to us, that we then have the new freedom and liberation to not want to sin anymore. Why would we want to? If we think about that, if we know that, if we embrace that truth, that's the point. That's the point of the gospel. We won't want to. I mean, it is absolutely mind-boggling that that could be true. But it is. It's true. Well, let me pray.